It's Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives for families of critically ill patients in intensive care so that you can make informed decisions, have peace of mind, real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making fast, even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. This is another episode of Your Questions Answered, and in last week's episode I answered another question from one of our readers, and the question last week was, my mom is in ICU after cardiac arrest. Does she have brain damage and can she survive? You can check out last week's question by clicking on the link below this video. In today's episode of Your Questions Answered, I want to answer a question from one of our readers, Ria. Ria's mother is recovering in intensive care. She's asking, is moving to a long-term acute care facility beneficial for her mom? So today's question is moving to a long-term acute care facility or LTAC beneficial for my mom? So basically what Ria's mom was going through is she had a cardiac arrest, and after the cardiac arrest Ria's mom ended up in ICU on a breathing tube with a ventilator during the COVID-19 crisis. Now, not that Ria's mom was diagnosed with COVID, but because of the COVID situation, Ria was locked out of intensive care and couldn't visit her mom, which is obviously a massive challenge if you only get information secondhand and if you only get information over the phone, right? So Ria was fortunate enough to engage our service so we can help her at least over the phone to make sense out of everything that was happening with her mom. So then the question came up inevitably after her mother couldn't be weaned off the ventilator that she needed potentially a tracheostomy, and that's where the question came in. Is doing a tracheostomy and then moving her to LTAC the right thing to do? And you might have heard me say before that we are strongly opposed to LTACs because you're going from intensive care treatment where you have intensive care doctors, intensive care nurses, respiratory therapists and so forth, to LTAC where you have none of it available. All of a sudden you have nurses looking after your loved one that are not qualified to look after ventilation and tracheostomy, unlike intensive care nurses. So it's a big risk going from ICU to LTAC with the tracheostomy, and if the tracheostomy can be avoided, then that is a good thing. Or if a tracheostomy is done, then you've got to look at staying in intensive care where your loved one can be weaned off the ventilator, or go home with a service like intensive care at home. So Ria's mum had airway swelling, and therefore the ICU team suggested that she should have a tracheostomy, because removing the breathing tube with airway swelling would have basically blocked off the airway, and Ria's mum might have suffocated from that. The other issue with Ria's mum was that her Glasgow Coma scale was less than an 11, and she wasn't really obeying commands and she wasn't really waking up, so therefore a tracheostomy was on the cards. But coming back to Ria's question, she really asked what should she be looking for if her mum goes to LTAC. And I've summarized that for her in an email, and I will summarize it here in a video. So, hi Ria. It's Patrick here from Intensive Care Hotline and from Intensive Care at Home. I'm just conveying this message to you to talk you through what to look for and what questions to ask if your mum is going to LTAC. So first of all, when somebody is going from ICU to long-term acute care or LTAC, you got to keep in mind that a patient is critically ill in intensive care, going from a breathing tube or endotracheal tube to a tracheostomy, and is in intensive care, obviously. It requires the specialist skills, often of intensive care nurses, intensive care doctors, respiratory therapists, physical therapists. They're all intensive care trained, because anything that's obviously that's requiring life support and tracheostomy ventilation, that's all considered life support, and it needs that specialized skill, specialized training that you're aware of by now. So when people go from ICU to LTAC, basically most of the time it's simply a money-saving exercise, especially when you are in the United States. Here in Australia, for example, there are very few LTACs. Most people get weaned off in intensive care with the tracheostomy and the ventilator successfully. And if they're not successful, well, here we are providing the intensive care at home service. So basically the care in intensive care, for example, continues with ICU doctors, ICU nurses, physical therapists. We don't have respiratory therapists here in Australia, but that doesn't really matter. The point is, when somebody is on life support, ventilation, tracheostomy, and even if they come off the ventilator while they're having a tracheostomy is still an artificial airway, and an artificial airway needs to be managed and maintained. And the unfortunate issue in LTAC is the skills that are available in intensive care are simply not available in LTAC. Also, you would have seen in ICU, now there's 1:1 or 1:2 nurse to patient ratio at the most, whereas in LTAC it's often 1:5 and sometimes even 1:10 overnight. And again, they're not ICU nurses. So you would have seen some of the reviews online for those LTAC facilities already, and you would know by now it's pretty dismal, those reviews. And from experience, we often have families come to us that have loved ones in LTAC, and they're literally begging us to help them get them home or get them back to ICU. So the unfortunate reality is that LTACs are designed to, number one, empty ICU beds quickly, and number two, to save money for the health funding agencies, such as Medicare, Medicaid, or if your mom has private health insurance. I don't know, but you get where I'm going with this. So the other issue in LTAC is that depending on the LTAC, there is only one visiting doctor often, again, and that is often a pulmonologist or a respiratory physician. But again, the ICU skills are usually not readily available there. So here is the other issue. Another issue is simply that when patients deteriorate in LTAC, they then need to go back to ICU. And now there are some LTACs that have an ICU attached, but again, it's usually not at the quality or at the level compared to a big metropolitan ICU. It's sort of a washed down ICU, if you will, but most LTACs don't have an ICU attached in the first place, which means patients do deteriorate and they often get shifted around, which is terrible. A critically ill patient doesn't need the added on stress of going from a hospital to LTAC, then potentially bouncing back to ICU. And often it's not the same ICU because the LTACs are often far away from the referring hospitals. There's a number of issues attached when patients go from ICU to LTAC. I have seen so many situations now where the LTACs, where families get referred to, is 2 hours away, sometimes even further. It's ridiculous. So from my perspective, there is very little rhyme or reason to send patients to LTACs. But questions to ask to the LTACs are the following. Number one, what is their skill level? Are they working with ICU nurses, ICU doctors because of the artificial airway management? And at the end of the day, the artificial airway is life support. And you can't just pick any RN or registered nurse to look after people with life support that come out of intensive care. And that's where the LTAC are falling short. The LTACs will most likely, when you ask that question, would most likely tell you that they have ventilator and tracheostomy competent nurses, but they're not ICU nurses. I can assure you of that. And then they often have nursing aides working with them, and it's just a terrible arrangement. Then you should be asking for what their doctor cover is. But they have a doctor. Do they have a doctor on site 24 hours a day? Because again, we are also finding there's often no doctor cover 24 hours a day in LTAC. So definitely ask them for that. Next question you need to ask is, what are their success rates? Ask them if they can talk, if you can talk to a family that had success in there with weaning. Ask them that. If they haven't got any case studies, or if they can't get you to talk to a family that has had success in their facility, you probably already know the answer whether you should send your mum there or not. The other issue is, you remember when earlier today we spoke to the doctor, let's just say your mum goes into LTAC and God forbid becomes end of life. You would also want appropriate palliative care services or hospice services to facilitate that if it came to that point. And again, LTACs often don't have that. And you can see the dynamics playing out there already. that when the patient leaves ICU, they go to LTAC, they bounce back to ICU, and often it's a different ICU. Therefore, your mum could end up in 3 hospitals or facilities within a week's time. And again, a critically ill patient needs consistency of care and not bounce around between places. So from that perspective, keeping your mum in the hospital at where she's at the moment with a tracheostomy and try and go home, I believe would be the preferred option. And going home obviously needs to be with a service like intensive care at home. So those are the things that I think are very important. And as I said, the other thing is you should be asking for what are their plans at an LTAC to escalate care and treatment if need be without getting your mum back into ICU. Because again, I've seen that sometimes patients obviously do deteriorate and then they go to ICU straight away. Some LTACs have the capabilities to escalate treatment to avoid ICU, but again, it's not the same as ICU. The bottom line is this, Ria. When somebody is on life support, tracheostomy, ventilation, but even tracheostomy without ventilation needs the specialized skills of intensive care nurses, intensive care doctors, full stop. Anything less than that is just simply dangerous, and the LTACs will probably promise you the world, but we know from experience it's dangerous and it's not happening. So I hope that helps, Ria. I will also send you an email shortly with an extension for your consulting and advocacy service with myself. Look out for the emails. Looking forward to talk to you again in the next few days. So, how can you become the best advocate for your critically ill loved one? How can you make informed decisions, get peace of mind, control, power and influence quickly whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? You will get to that all-important feeling of making informed decisions, get peace of mind, control, power and influence when you download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you will learn quickly how to make informed decisions, get peace of mind, real power and real control, and how you can influence decision-making fast whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Your free Instant Impact Report gives you in-depth insight that you must know whilst your loved one is critically ill or is even dying in intensive care. Sign up and download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you will learn how to speak the secret intensive care language so that the doctors and the nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In your free report, you will also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions, discover the many competing interests in intensive care and how your critically ill loved one's treatment may depend on those competing interests, how to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. You will get 5 mind-blowing tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to making informed decisions, get peace of mind, control, power and influence in your situation. You will get real-world examples that you can easily adapt to your and your critically ill loved one's situation. How to stop being intimidated by the intensive care team and how you will be seen as equals. You will get crucial behind-the-scenes insight so that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care and how you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care, and it's not what you think. Thank you for tuning into this week's Your Questions Answered episode, and I'll see you again next week in another update. Make sure you also have a look at our blog section for more tips and strategies, or simply send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com with your questions. Also, have a look at our membership site, intensivecaresupport.org, for families of critically ill patients in intensive care. You can also call me, find phone numbers on the top of our website. Also, have a look at our ebook section, and you can also get one-on-one consulting and advocacy with me over the phone, via Skype or via email by clicking on the relevant tabs on the top of the website. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll talk to you in a few days.